Okay, so today we'll be covering classes. We're going to cover 6 things today. The first is the
Where's
object.
Cindy?
So her computer is broken, so she
Oh.
can't be attending classes. But we'll be covering the Java object-oriented programming and why that is important. And then we'll also cover some basics about Java classes and about Java constructors. We'll also cover Java class attributes and class methods. We'll review what static and non-static means, and then at the end, you guys can create your own classes using Replit. Okay, so that's the class objective. Object-oriented programming is you guys probably have seen it before, but is where the methods are accessed by directly using the object. So you would have methods within objects. And it has several advantages over procedural programming because it's faster and easier to execute. It provides a clear structure for the programs, which you guys will see when we cover objects, hopefully on Friday. Also helps to keep the Java code dry. That's an acronym, which stands for Don't Repeat Yourself. And it makes the code a lot easier to maintain, modify, and debug. And it actually makes it a lot more human readable. And that's very important when you're trying to debug the code. Java is not the only language that uses object-oriented programming. There's a lot out there, but it's one that comes in mind when we talk about OOP. OOP makes it possible to create full reusable applications, less code and shorter development time. And as we know, elegant code is always better. So with that, let's move on to the next one. All right, so here you have a very basic class. Okay, you have the class cat. So what is a class? The word class is related to classification, category, or set. Okay, so classes in Java and many other languages are your own variable types. Okay, declaring a class, typically classes are defined in separate files. So for this one, you would have cat in a file called cat.java. Because in Java, can someone tell me why you would name it as your class? Why you would name a file the same as the class? William, you want to answer?
So there won't be an error?
That's right. Because in Java, name actually does matter. The file names matters, and it has to match the name of the public class that you're declaring. But this is different, right? This is not a public class. Okay, so the class cat, if you write a file called my program, within that file, you declare a class called cat. That's not going to give you an error, right? Because you're making that class in addition to the public class my program. It's within, it's not within that class, but you're making it in addition to that. But typically classes are defined in separate files. A .java files only allowed one public class, and the keyword here is public. Okay, you can have many classes within one file, but only one of them can be public. And we'll kind of review what public, static, private means later. But though it can have multiple non-public classes, it can only have one public class. So just keep that in mind, okay? You're going to avoid a lot of errors in the future. Oh, oops. Okay, classes declared inside of other classes. So kind of like a nested loop, right? You have classes declared inside of other classes. So if the class cat, right, and here it's declared outside of the class my program, but if it was inside that public class my program, it's called inner classes. It will be, you would say cat is a inner class of my program. Okay. The same way you would say something about a loop that's inside another loop, right? You would call it the inner loop, right? So it's very intuitive here. If a class is inside another class, you would call it the inner class of that class. you cannot declare classes within functions or methods. Okay, so you can't have, void my program, and in there you can't create a class called cat, right? You can't declare classes inside of functions or methods, with the exception, and this is important, with an exception of anonymous classes. So you can, in fact, declare anonymous classes within functions or methods, but that's outside of the scope of this lesson. So see this code that declares a class cat. Okay, so look at this code. Fairly simple, okay? You're instantiating objects of cat. Well, you might declare an integer with int x equals to f. So does anyone here not know how to declare an integer? Yeah, and then I'll explain, but I think everyone here knows how to declare an integer, right? So while you might declare an integer with int x equals to f, classes are instantiated. Okay, that's the key word. Classes are instantiated, which means they're created with a new operator, right? Quote unquote, new operator. For example, cat x is equals to new cat parentheses. And it creates a variable of type cat with name x. Right, so if you try this on your applet, right? If you try cat x equals to new cat parentheses, it's not going to work because it's a custom class, right? It's a custom variable. Okay, so a class is like a variable type that contains other variables. And this is very important. You can create variables inside a class, and you would be able to access the variables inside that class using OOP, like we talked about before, object-oriented programming, okay? The variables within an object are called fields, okay? The variables within an object are called fields, quote-unquote fields, F-I-E-L-D-S, like a baseball field, a baseball field. And here we can add fields to the cat type, okay? So can someone tell me what are the two fields inside class cat on this slide?
So each cat contains an age and a name variable. And the age is an integer and the name is a string.
And what are the two fields?
The two fields are integers and strings.
Yep. Okay, so William's right? Those two variables, right? Like we discussed before, the variables within an object or a class are called fields. And we can add additional fields to that class by creating more variables. So here's I know there's a lot of code on this slide, but most of it are just variables, okay? And you're accessing variables using the method we talked about before, which is object-oriented programming. So once the class is fields, you can modify and access the fields for each object you create. Let me repeat that. You can modify and access the fields for each object you create. So it's not like arrays where you cannot modify the values.
But can you make it like an array? So like if you know how many variables are in unique, can you like make all of them like strings or integers, since like arrays can only contain one data type? So like, can you create a class that asks as an array?
Okay, good question. So William asked, let me just repeat the question for everyone else. So William asked if you can create a class that mimics an array. So, okay, so an array has the same variable types for all its values, right? And if you want to, say you want to create a string array using the the class functionality. What you would do is you would create, it would have to take some parameters, right? The parameters would be the length of that array. And so you would create, so there would have to be a loop somewhere. And the values will all have to be the same data type or not. And I think, so William, I think that question relates to constructors. And I think we'll get to constructors later in a while. But yeah, just hold on to that question and I'll get to you. Let me just keep going. Anyways, so once a class is fields, you can modify and access the fields for each object you create. Okay, even though we declared an age and string name only once in the prior example, every cat has an age and name. Mimi has an age and a name. Okay, and Garfield has a different age and name. In other words, by creating the class cat, and by the way, I'm talking about this slide. Okay, by creating the class cat, we can create these names / page pairs every time we create a cat. Right, every time we create this class called cat, we're creating these name / page pairs every time, right? So we access the name inside of Mimi. Does everyone see where Mimi is? It's the third cat Mimi equals the new cat parentheses, right? Third line. So we access the name inside of Mimi with Mimi.name. Okay, just like we talked about before, object-oriented programming, which we can either modify or print, right? We can modify Mimi.name if we want to. Mimi.name equals to Bob, right? We just modified it, or we can print it out. System.out.println printline Mimi.name. And if I had modified it to Bob, Mimi.name equals to quote Bob and quote. When you print it, it's going to say Bob because you just modified it. So pretty straightforward in the beginning, right? And so we have more codes on this slide, but William, I think is this similar to what you're asking?
Oh yeah.
Okay. So
instead, can you do class at int 1, string 2, string 3, float 4, double 5, string 6? Can you do that?
So different, you were saying different primitives inside that class. Okay, so you want the variable types to be different. Yeah, I think it's, or are you talking about the parameters?
No, like in the class cat at the bottom, can you do like int 1 or int 0?
Okay.
And then a second primitive data type, string 1, and then like float 2, double 3, string 4, like all of those values in the class.
Yeah, you can create any data type, any variable types inside that class. It doesn't have to be the same.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
But if you were to create, say you want to create int 0, and then you also want to create string 0, and then you also want to create double 0. The data types are different, but like the names are the same. That's not going to work because when you access it through OOP, right? You do cat.0, it's going to get confused because there's 3 different variables called 0, right? So that's not going to work. But if the names are unique, then yes, you can definitely instantiate that. And just like other variable types, you can operate. Okay, I'm talking about this slide now. But great question, William. And just like other variable types, you can create an array of class types. I'll repeat that. So just like other variable types, you can create an array of class types. However, each index must be initialized using the new object name parentheses constructor. In this case, right? We have class cat. You have to initialize it using new cat parentheses constructor before you can access its fields. We'll talk about constructor in a little bit, but since kitties bracket 0, so look on the slide, since kitty bracket 0 is a cat, right? So the cat array is called kitties, and the first element of that array is the cat object, cat class. We can access its field. By the way, I'm going to use object and class interchangeably. I know it's there. So the short answer is that a class is an object, but an object is not necessarily a class. Okay, so a class is an object, but not all classes are objects, but not all objects are classes. That's just the short way to remember. But yes, so since kitties, the first element of kitties, index 0, is a cat, we can access its fields with kitties bracket 0 dot name using OOP, right? We can do that because of object-oriented programming. Kitties bracket 0 dot name. As you can see, the for loop allows us to iterate over all the cats in the array. So you're looping through all the cats inside that array, inside that cat array called kitty. Now let's, okay, next slide. We're going to talk about attributes. Attributes, you can access attributes of a class by creating an object of that class. So how do you create an object of the class? You use the constructor, right? New class name parentheses, right? By using the dot syntax. The following example will create an object of the main class with the name my object, right? We use the X attribute on the object to print its value. So this now class methods. So I want to talk about Java class methods. Methods are different than attributes. So attributes are typically values that you access. They can be in a string, they can be an int, they can be a character, they can be a double, right? They're typically static values that you can access. Of course, you can modify them, you can print them out, but they're usually some sort of variable, right? A value that you can access. Methods are functions that you can run. And yes, you can store functions inside classes. In here, you have a function called make sound. Does anyone not see the function make sound? It's at the bottom. Right below, you have the field. Remember, all variables inside a class are called fields. So you have the field name. Below that, you have the function make sound. And the void, the reason it has a void before the name is because it's not going to return any value as a result of that function. And all the function does is that it print line the word mail. Okay. Hence the name makes sense. Okay, so methods are functions inside of classes, just like fields were variables inside of classes. Methods are functions inside of classes. Let's see our first method. So as you can see, you need an object to run method. By object, I mean a class variables, in this case, a cat. Let's see a method that uses fields within the Boolean is kitty, which is on the next slide. So don't worry if you don't see it yet. Okay, so we have a function right below the function make sound. This time it returns a true or false value, okay? It returns the Boolean as a result, and it's called is kitty. Inside of this is kitty method, okay? The variable age is a field, okay? The variable age is a field. Thus, the variable age is different depending on which cat we run is kitty on. Okay, does anyone not understand that? Okay, each cat we have can have a different value for the field age. Okay, we can set different values for each copy, or better, instantiated object of cat. Can have different values for the field age. Okay, so for Mimi, the age was set to 2. So we have 2 cats here. I don't know if you guys can see it. Probably should bold it next time. But in the under public class my program, there's 2 cats here. We have cat Mimi, with new cat parentheses, and then below that, about 3 lines below that, we have cat Garfield. Okay, which is also a cat. Both are instantiated with the class constructor cat parentheses, new cat parentheses. But for Mimi, the age was set to 2. So is kitty returned true, right? Because a kitty is, very young. And for Garfield, age was set to 42. Does everyone see that? So for Garfield, Garfield.age equals to 42, right? So for Garfield, the age was set to 42. So is kitty returned false? Both are cats, but they have different values for the field age. This allows us to create behavior that is different depending on which cat we run the method on. And this is immensely useful. So this is just a review for static versus non-static qualifiers for those who, we covered it about 3 lessons ago, but yeah, so static means it can be accessed without creating an object of the class, and public is where you can only be accessed by objects. So not going to spend too much time on that, but okay, so now we're on to Java constructors. Now we talked briefly about constructors before, but I just want to go in a little bit more details about constructors and what they are. Creating and using constructors. Java provides the ability for us to create a constructor to get variables when we create a cat. When we instantiate, right? Those are people use it interchangeably. Instantiate and create means the same thing. So look at this code, okay? We have a public class called my program. You have a cat called X, right? You use the constructor to instantiate X, and you set the field age to 1, right? And then you set the field name to Bob. So when you print x.name, it's going to say Bob. Okay, now just to continue on instructors. The constructor here is the special function cat parentheses string a comma int b parentheses. So right below the field name, you have a constructor. So this is not the default constructor, right? You're modifying the default constructor so that it's taking 2 arguments. Can someone tell me what the 2 arguments are?
The 2 arguments are the age and the name. The string A and the int B.
Right, exactly. So arguments are also known as parameters, are the input of that function, right? And they're actually setting name to A and age to B. So you can't really modify the values of a parameter, but you can set it, use that value, you can access the value. So very good. Java knows this is the constructor for class cat. Actually, I have a question. How does Java know that this is the constructor? Because you're modifying it, right? You're modifying it so that it doesn't look the same as the previous constructor. So let's go back and look at what the previous constructor looks like. It's just new cat parentheses, right? That's the default constructor. So when you change it to cat string A int B, when you define it differently than what it was before, how do you think how does Java recognize this as the constructor?
Because you said it modifies something.
Right, because the name, right, is still cat. You're only modifying it, but you're not changing the name. So if we name the constructor anything other than cat, Java won't recognize this function as a constructor. It will just recognize this as another function that you created. So Java knows this is the constructor, even though you modify it for class cat, because the function is the same name as the class, right? In addition, constructors cannot have return types. So they can't even have the return type void. So notice how this function doesn't have a void in front of it, right? Whereas, just want to give you guys some comparison. Whereas this function at the bottom, right, make sound, has a void in front of it. Now, you can only, so Java knows this is constructor for class cat because the function is the same name as the class. And how do you use the constructor? You can only use the constructor when you're creating a variable with new cat. And the action new cat does two things in Java. It creates the object in the computer memory, and it also runs the constructor with the parameters in the parentheses. So if we run new cat, then string A will be Joe and int B will be 5. Okay, so you can only use the constructor when you're creating a variable with new cat. Now, this is just you see another constructor. Now this time instead of taking 2 parameters, we're taking 1, and the other field, the field age is set to a fixed value, so it's going to be 42. Public classes. Okay, so the default constructor is just going to be new cat parentheses, right? That's the constructor call. Okay, it's just a review of what we already covered. Okay, so just for some review, constructor name must match the class name, cannot have a return type like void. Also know that the constructor is called when the object is created. Okay, I want to save enough time for you guys to experiment with class, so I'm just going to rush through the last few slides. But all classes of constructors by default, if you do not create a class constructor yourself, Java creates one for you. So don't worry about that. However, then you're not able to set initial values for object attributes. So most people use constructors to set attributes for when they instantiate class types. But and here's the demo activities, right, where you can create your own class and be creative. So that's it for the slides. You guys can jump on Replit, experiment with constructors, attributes, try to create different fields, try to create, here's a challenge, try to create a field with primitive string, integer, and a double, and create at least 2 functions, not a constructor, modify the constructor, but in addition to that, create at least 2 functions. Doesn't matter if it's void, doesn't matter if it's Boolean, just create 2 functions within that class. And do this on Replit, by the way. I don't know if I made that clear enough. Okay, so if you guys are done, we can end a few minutes early, so just 4 more minutes. But yeah, if you guys finished, you can leave.